The departure of the Royal Guard convoy was as impressive as their arrival had been. The vehicles moved out in perfect formation, with Colonel Morrison's car leading the way. Marcus rode in the second vehicle, still somewhat stunned by the extraordinary response to what had begun as a routine walk home from work. As the convoy disappeared down the street, the crowd of onlookers began to disperse, but the conversations continued. People were already sharing their photos and videos online, and the hashtag #NotYourRoyalGuard response was beginning to trend on social media. Many posts expressed amazement at the military's quick and overwhelming response to support one of their soldiers. Sergeant Williams and his fellow officers remained at the scene for a few more minutes, processing what had just happened. In all their years of police work, none of them had ever encountered anything quite like this situation. "Well," said Constable Davis, "I guess we learned something new about Royal Guards today." Sergeant Williams nodded, still feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the experience. "I followed procedure correctly," he said, "but I never expected it to turn into something this big." The local news crews were already preparing their reports about the incident. The story was perfect for television, a simple misunderstanding that had escalated into a massive military response, complete with colorful uniforms and an impressive display of British ceremonial tradition. By evening, news outlets around the world were carrying the story. International media found the incident fascinating as an example of British military tradition and the respect accorded to Royal Guards. The videos of dozens of guards in their famous red tunics gathering on a London street were broadcast globally. At Buckingham Palace, Colonel Morrison was briefing his superiors about the day's events. The response had been deliberately impressive, designed to send a clear message about how the military supported its personnel and the respect due to Royal Guards. "The incident has actually generated quite positive publicity," he reported. "The public response has been very supportive of our actions, and it's reinforced the importance and authority of the Royal Guard unit." Captain Hayes was conducting her own review of the situation with Marcus, who had finally made it home and gotten some rest. They met in her office the following afternoon to discuss what had happened and what lessons could be learned from the experience. "How are you feeling about everything?" she asked him. "Honestly, ma'am, I'm still amazed by the response," Marcus replied. "I never expected that one police stop would result in the entire regiment showing up to help me." "That's exactly the point," Captain Hayes explained. "When one of our guards is challenged or questioned, it reflects on all of us and on the institution we represent. The colonel wanted to make sure that everyone understands the authority and respect that comes with the uniform you wear." The incident had indeed served as an educational experience for everyone involved. The London Metropolitan Police received the promised training materials about Royal Guards and their authority to carry ceremonial weapons. New protocols were established to help officers quickly verify the identity of military personnel in ceremonial dress. For Marcus, the experience had been both embarrassing and deeply moving. He had always known that the Royal Guard unit was like a family, but seeing dozens of his colleagues and senior officers come to his aid had reinforced his pride in serving with such a dedicated group of soldiers. The story continued to circulate on social media for weeks afterward, with many people expressing admiration for the British military's commitment to supporting its soldiers. The incident became a popular example of institutional loyalty and the respect accorded to ceremonial military units. Several months later, Marcus was promoted to Lance Corporal, partly in recognition of how professionally he had handled the difficult situation. He continued to serve as a Royal Guard with even greater pride, knowing that he was part of an organization that would go to extraordinary lengths to support its members. Sergeant Williams also benefited from the experience. His professional handling of an unusual situation, combined with his willingness to follow proper procedures while remaining respectful to Marcus, was noted by his superiors. He received commendation for his conduct during the incident. The story became part of Royal Guard folklore, told to new recruits as an example of the respect and support they could expect from their unit. It also became a popular tale among London police officers, shared as an example of how a routine call could develop into something completely unexpected. Years later, tourists visiting London would sometimes ask their guides about the famous incident where an entire Royal Guard regiment responded to help one of their members. The story had become part of the city's modern legends, a reminder of the traditions and loyalties that continue to define British military service. For everyone involved, the incident served as a reminder that even in modern times, the ceremonial aspects of British military tradition carry real authority and command genuine respect. The sight of dozens of Royal Guards gathering on a London street had been a powerful demonstration of institutional solidarity that resonated with people around the world. The rumble of heavy vehicles filled the air as a convoy of 6 additional military trucks arrived on Victoria Street. What had begun as a simple police stop had now transformed into something resembling a military parade. Colonel Morrison himself had decided to personally oversee the situation, bringing with him a full company of Royal Guards. The colonel emerged from the lead vehicle wearing his full dress uniform, complete with medals and insignia that immediately identified him as a senior military commander. Behind him came nearly 30 Royal Guards, all in perfect formation, their red tunics creating a striking display of British military precision. The crowd of onlookers had now grown to over 100 people. What had started as a few curious pedestrians had become a significant gathering, with people calling their friends and family to come see the incredible scene unfolding on the London street. Social media was buzzing with photos and videos of the massive Royal Guard presence. Sergeant Williams felt his heart rate increase as he realized the situation had grown far beyond anything he had experienced in his 15-year career. When a boy, he had stopped one man with a sword. He never imagined it would result in what looked like a full military mobilization. "Ma'am," he said quietly to Captain Hayes, "this seems like quite a large response for a simple identity verification." Captain Hayes was equally surprised by the colonel's decision to bring such a substantial force. She suspected that this was about much more than just helping Marcus. This was the military making a statement about how seriously they took any challenge to their authority and the respect due to Royal Guards. Colonel Morrison approached the group with the measured stride of a career military officer. Every Royal Guard in the area immediately came to attention, creating an impressive display of discipline and unity. Even the police officers found themselves standing straighter in the presence of such obvious authority. "Captain Hayes," the colonel said, "what's the current status of this situation?" "Sir, the matter has been resolved. The police officers have verified Guard Thompson's identity and authorization. He's free to go." Colonel Morrison nodded, then turned to address Sergeant Williams directly. "Officer, I understand you were responding to a citizen complaint and following proper procedures. However, I want to ensure that all London police are properly educated about Royal Guards and their authority to carry ceremonial weapons." "Yes, sir," Sergeant Williams replied, feeling somewhat intimidated by the colonel's presence and the dozens of uniformed guards surrounding them. The colonel had brought along the unit's education officer, Major Thompson, who stepped forward with a briefcase full of materials. "We'll be providing training materials to your department," the major announced, "so that future encounters with Royal Guards can be handled more efficiently." Meanwhile, Marcus stood in the center of what had become a massive military demonstration on his behalf. He was grateful for the support, but also somewhat embarrassed by the scale of the response. All he had wanted was to walk home quietly after his shift. The media had begun to arrive as well. Local news crews had been monitoring social media and police radio channels, and the sight of dozens of Royal Guards gathered on a London street was too unusual to ignore. Reporters were setting up cameras and interviewing witnesses about what they had seen. Colonel Morrison was very aware of the media presence and the potential for this incident to become a significant news story. He had made the decision to respond with overwhelming force, partly to ensure that the public understood the British military's commitment to supporting its soldiers, but also to demonstrate the respect and authority that Royal Guards commanded. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel announced to the crowd, "what you have witnessed today is the British military's commitment to our service members. Royal Guards are highly trained soldiers who deserve the same respect as any member of our armed forces. They have full authority to carry their ceremonial weapons as part of their official duties." The speech was clearly intended for both the crowd and the news cameras that were now recording everything. The colonel wanted to ensure that the public understood this incident had been a misunderstanding, not any kind of wrongdoing by Marcus or the police. Captain Hayes approached Marcus and spoke quietly. "Guard Thompson, are you ready to head home? We can provide you with transportation if you prefer not to walk." Marcus looked around at the incredible scene that had developed around him. Dozens of his fellow guards had come to support him. Senior officers had personally intervened on his behalf, and the entire situation had become a demonstration of military solidarity that he would remember for the rest of his life. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "I think I'd like to take that ride home." As the Royal Guards began to organize for departure, the crowd continued to watch in fascination. Many people were still taking pictures and videos, creating a record of one of the most unusual police encounters in recent London history. The scene would soon become famous on social media and news outlets around the world. The sound of engines approaching caught everyone's attention on Victoria Street. Two black military vehicles with official government plates were moving quickly through traffic, their priority lights flashing. The vehicles pulled up to the scene. With precision and immediately, several figures in military uniform began stepping out. Captain Hayes emerged from the first vehicle, her officer's uniform crisp and her bearing unmistakably authoritative. Behind her came Lieutenant Roberts and Sergeant Major Collins, followed by 4 Royal Guards in full ceremonial dress. The sight was impressive and immediately changed the atmosphere of the entire situation. The police officers looked at each other with surprise. They had expected maybe one person from the palace to verify Marcus's identity, but this looked like a full military operation. The growing crowd of onlookers became even more excited, with people pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a much bigger event than anyone had anticipated. "I'm Captain Hayes, commanding officer of the Royal Guard unit," she announced as she approached Sergeant Williams. Her voice was clear and professional, leaving no doubt about her authority. "I understand you have one of my soldiers here." Sergeant Williams straightened up noticeably. He had dealt with military personnel before, but never with someone of such obvious rank and importance. "Yes, ma'am. We received a report about someone carrying a weapon in this area, and we stopped this gentleman for questioning." Captain Hayes looked over at Marcus, who was clearly relieved to see his commanding officer. She could see that he was unharmed and being treated respectfully, but she also noticed the crowd of onlookers and the multiple police vehicles. This situation had grown far beyond what it should have been. "Guard Thompson," she said, addressing Marcus directly. "Are you all right?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, his relief evident in his voice. "I was just walking home after my shift when the officer stopped me about my ceremonial sword." Captain Hayes turned back to Sergeant Williams. "Officer, Guard Thompson is indeed one of my soldiers. He completed his overnight duty at Buckingham Palace and was traveling home in regulation uniform, which includes his ceremonial weapon as authorized by British military law." The police sergeant nodded, beginning to understand that he had stopped someone who was completely legitimate and authorized to carry the weapon in question. But he still needed to follow proper procedure. "Ma'am, I appreciate you coming out here," Sergeant Williams said, "but I'll need to see some official documentation that verifies his authorization to carry that weapon." Captain Hayes had come prepared for exactly this request. She pulled out a folder containing Marcus's complete military file, including his authorization papers, training certificates, and service record. She also had official letters from both the palace and the Ministry of Defense that explained the legal status of Royal Guards and their equipment. "These documents should answer all your questions," she said, handing the folder to the sergeant. "Guard Thompson has been serving with distinction for 3 years and has full authorization to carry his ceremonial sword as part of his official duties." While Sergeant Williams reviewed the documents, the 4 additional Royal Guards who had arrived with Captain Hayes took positions near Marcus. They didn't do anything threatening or aggressive, but their presence sent a clear message that the Royal Guard unit took care of its own members. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger, and many people were now taking pictures and videos of the unusual scene. It wasn't often that regular citizens got to see multiple Royal Guards together, outside of official ceremonies or tourist areas. Lieutenant Roberts approached Captain Hayes and spoke quietly. "Ma'am, we're getting quite a bit of attention here. Should we be concerned about this becoming a public relations issue? Captain Hayes had already been thinking about exactly that problem. Images and videos of royal guards being questioned by police could easily be misinterpreted and cause embarrassment for the military and the royal family. She needed to resolve this situation quickly and professionally. "Officer," she said to Sergeant Williams, "I hope we can conclude this matter promptly. As you can see, we're attracting quite a crowd and Guard Thompson has done nothing wrong. He was simply returning home after completing his assigned duties." Sergeant Williams had finished reviewing the documents and was now convinced that Marcus was exactly who he claimed to be. The paperwork was extensive and clearly official. He realized that he had unknowingly stopped one of the soldiers responsible for guarding the Queen herself. "Ma'am, everything appears to be in order," he said, handing the folder back to Captain Hayes. "I apologize for the inconvenience, but we had to investigate the report we received." Captain Hayes accepted the apology graciously. "I understand, officer. You were doing your job, and we appreciate your dedication to public safety. However, I hope this incident can serve as a learning experience for future reference." But even as the official resolution was taking place, Captain Hayes noticed that more military vehicles were approaching. She looked confused for a moment, then realized what was happening. The colonel had apparently decided to take even more decisive action than she had expected. The new vehicles pulling up to the scene were even more impressive than the first two. These were official Royal Guard transport vehicles, and they carried even more personnel. It appeared that what had started as a simple misunderstanding was about to become an even bigger demonstration of military presence and authority. Marcus watched in amazement as more of his fellow guards arrived on the scene. He had never seen such a response to any single incident, and he was both grateful for the support and somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of the reaction to his situation. At Buckingham Palace, Captain Elizabeth Hayes was reviewing the morning duty reports when her phone rang. As the commanding officer responsible for the Royal Guard unit, she handled all matters related to her soldiers' welfare and duties. The call came from the palace's main security office. "Captain Hayes, we've just received an unusual report," said the security coordinator. "A member of the public has called to say that one of our guards is being detained by police on Victoria Street. They mentioned seeing someone in full-dress uniform surrounded by several police cars." Captain Hayes put down her paperwork immediately. This was exactly the kind of situation she had been trained to handle quickly and efficiently. Her guards were highly trained soldiers who represented the British Crown, and any issue involving them needed immediate attention. "Do we know which guard it might be?" she asked. The caller mentioned it was someone who appeared to have just finished a shift. Based on the location and timing, it's likely Guard Thompson from the overnight detail. Captain Hayes knew Marcus Thompson well. He was one of her most reliable and professional guards, with a spotless record during his 3 years of service. The idea that he would be involved in any kind of trouble with the police was almost unthinkable. "I'll handle this personally," she told the security coordinator. "Please inform the colonel immediately." Within minutes, Captain Hayes had gathered additional information and was making phone calls to determine exactly what was happening. She contacted the local police station, but they had no record of any incident involving a royal guard. This meant the situation was still developing on the street. Back on Victoria Street, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger. People were fascinated by the sight of someone in the famous red uniform being questioned by multiple police officers. Several tourists were taking photographs and videos, and some were posting them on social media with captions wondering what was happening. Marcus remained calm and cooperative, but he was becoming increasingly concerned about the growing spectacle. As a royal guard, he was used to being photographed and watched by tourists, but this was entirely different. He was being treated as a potential criminal, and the situation was becoming more embarrassing by the minute. "Officer, may I suggest you contact Captain Hayes at Buckingham Palace?" Marcus asked Sergeant Williams. "She's my commanding officer and can verify everything I've told you." Sergeant Williams was beginning to feel that perhaps he had made this situation more complicated than it needed to be. The man in the red uniform had remained polite and professional throughout their interaction. His story was consistent, his identification appeared genuine, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by the police attention. However, Protocol required that any weapon-related call be investigated thoroughly. The sergeant couldn't simply let someone walk away with a sword based only on their word, even if their story seemed believable. "We'll need to verify your story properly," Sergeant Williams told Marcus. "I hope you understand that we have to be careful about these things." At that moment, Constable Davis's radio crackled to life. "All units on Victoria Street, be advised that we've received a call from Buckingham Palace. They're sending someone to assist with the situation involving their guard." This news changed everything. If Buckingham Palace was involved, then Marcus's story was likely true. But it also meant that this simple street encounter was about to become much more official and potentially more complicated. Captain Hayes had wasted no time in responding to the situation. She had contacted Colonel Morrison, the senior officer in charge of all Royal Guard operations, and briefed him on what she knew. The colonel had immediately authorized her to take whatever action was necessary to resolve the situation and protect the reputation of the Royal Guards. "Take a full escort," the colonel had instructed. "This has the potential to become a public relations issue if it's not handled properly." Captain Hayes understood exactly what he meant. The Royal Guards were one of Britain's most recognizable symbols, known around the world for their discipline and professionalism. Any incident that made them look bad could reflect poorly on the entire British military, and even the royal family. She quickly assembled a response team consisting of herself, 2 other officers, and 4 additional Royal Guards in full dress uniform. They climbed into 2 official military vehicles and headed toward Victoria Street, with emergency authorization to respond to the incident. As the vehicles raced through London traffic, Captain Hayes was already planning how to handle the situation. She needed to verify that Marcus was safe and being treated properly, ensure that the police understood they were dealing with a legitimate soldier, and minimize any negative publicity that might result from the incident. The police officers on Victoria Street had no idea that a full military response was heading their way. They were still trying to figure out how to properly verify Marcus's identity and whether they should take him to the station for further questioning. Marcus, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly worried. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and the idea that his military career might be affected by this misunderstanding was deeply concerning. He hoped that someone from the palace would arrive soon to clear up the confusion and allow him to finally go home and rest after his long night of duty. Sergeant Williams approached the man in the red uniform with careful steps. His years of training had taught him to remain calm and professional in all situations, but this was definitely unusual. The person he was looking at wore what appeared to be some kind of military costume, complete with a sword hanging from his belt. "Excuse me, sir," Sergeant Williams called out in a polite but firm voice. "Could I have a word with you?" Marcus stopped walking and turned to face the officer. He was surprised by the request but maintained his professional demeanor. "Good morning, officer. How can I help you?" The police sergeant looked at Marcus more closely now. The red uniform was incredibly detailed and expensive looking. The brass buttons gleamed in the morning sunlight, and every part of the outfit appeared to be perfectly maintained. But what caught Sergeant Williams' attention most was the sword at Marcus's side. "Sir, I need to ask you about the weapon you're carrying," the officer said, pointing toward the ceremonial sword. "Do you have a license for that?" Marcus looked down at his sword with confusion. In all his years as a Royal Guard, no one had ever questioned his right to carry his ceremonial weapon. It was part of his official uniform, issued by the British Army and completely legal for him to possess and carry while on duty or traveling to and from his duties. "Officer, this is my service sword," Marcus explained patiently. "I'm a Royal Guard. I just finished my shift at Buckingham Palace." Sergeant Williams studied the young man's face carefully. The story sounded believable, but the officer had learned never to take anything at face value. Anyone could claim to be anything these days. He had seen people dress up in all kinds of uniforms for various reasons, and not all of them were innocent. "Sir, you have any identification that proves you're a Royal Guard?" the sergeant asked. Marcus reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out his military identification card. He handed it to the officer and waited while Sergeant Williams examined it carefully. The ID looked official, with all the proper seals and photographs, but the officer had never seen a Royal Guard ID before and wasn't sure what to look for to verify its authenticity. Meanwhile, other police officers had begun arriving at the scene. Sergeant Williams had called for backup earlier, and now 2 more patrol cars pulled up to the curb. The additional officers stepped out of their vehicles and looked at the situation with curiosity. It wasn't every day they saw someone in such an elaborate military uniform being questioned on a London street. "What's the situation?" asked Constable Davis, one of the newly arrived officers. "This gentleman claims to be a Royal Guard," Sergeant Williams replied. "He's carrying a sword and says he just finished his duty at the palace." The other officers gathered around to examine Marcus and his uniform. None of them had much experience with Royal Guards outside of seeing them on television or in tourist photographs. They knew the guards existed and worked at various royal residences, but they had never actually met one in person or dealt with any situations involving them. Marcus began to feel increasingly uncomfortable as more police officers arrived and started discussing his situation as if he weren't there. He had always been treated with respect when in uniform, and this level of suspicion was entirely new to him. Other pedestrians had started to stop and watch the scene, some taking pictures with their phones. "Look," Marcus said, trying to remain calm, "you can call Buckingham Palace if you need to verify my identity. They'll confirm that I'm a Royal Guard and that I was on duty last night." Sergeant Williams considered this suggestion. It made sense, but he wasn't sure who to call or how to go about verifying such an unusual claim. The palace wasn't exactly listed in the phone book under P for Palace, and he didn't want to look foolish by calling the wrong number. One of the younger officers, Constable Martinez, had an idea. "Maybe we should take him to the station while we sort this out," she suggested. "We can do a proper check on his background there." Marcus felt his heart sink. The idea of being taken to a police station while wearing his Royal Guard uniform was embarrassing and humiliating. He had done nothing wrong, but he could see that the situation was getting more complicated by the minute. "Officers, I understand your concerns," Marcus said, "but I really am who I say I am. I've been serving as a Royal Guard for 3 years. I have colleagues who can vouch for me." Sergeant Williams looked at his watch. It was still early in the morning, and he wasn't sure if anyone at the palace would even be available to answer questions about Royal Guards. The whole situation was becoming more confusing rather than less so. As the officers continued to discuss what to do next, none of them noticed that someone in the growing crowd of onlookers had already called Buckingham Palace to report that one of their guards was being detained by police. The phone call was about to set in motion a series of events that would transform this simple misunderstanding into something much bigger and more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy streets of London as Sergeant Williams sat in his patrol car, sipping his 3rd cup of coffee. It was going to be another routine day, or so he thought. The radio crackled with the usual reports of minor traffic violations and noise complaints. Nothing unusual for a Tuesday morning in the heart of the city. Around the corner from Buckingham Palace, a tall figure in a distinctive red uniform walked with purpose down the sidewalk. The Royal Guard, whose name was Marcus Thompson, had just finished his overnight duty at the palace. His bearskin hat was tucked under his arm, and his polished boots clicked against the pavement with each step. After 12 hours of standing motionless protecting the Queen's residence, all he wanted was to get home to his small flat and rest. Marcus had been serving as a Royal Guard for 3 years. It was a job that required incredible discipline and dedication. Standing perfectly still for hours, ignoring tourists who tried to make him laugh or move, dealing with all kinds of weather conditions. But he loved serving his country and took pride in wearing the famous red tunic and tall black hat that tourists from around the world came to see. On this particular morning, Marcus was exhausted. His shift had been especially challenging because of a large group of American tourists who had spent most of the night trying to get him to react. They had made jokes, taken countless selfies, and even tried to tickle him with feathers. Through it all, Marcus had remained perfectly still as his training required. As he walked down the quiet street, Marcus noticed a police car slowly following him. He didn't think much of it at first. Police patrols were common in this area, especially near the palace. But after a few blocks, the car was still behind him, matching his pace. The officer inside seemed to be watching him very carefully. What Marcus didn't know was that Sergeant Williams had received a strange call about 30 minutes earlier. A concerned citizen had reported seeing someone in military uniform walking around the area with what looked like a weapon. The caller couldn't give many details, just that the person looked suspicious and was carrying something that might be dangerous. Sergeant Williams had been a police officer for 15 years. He had learned to take all calls seriously, no matter how strange they might seem. In today's world, you could never be too careful about security, especially near important government buildings. He had already called for backup just in case, but decided to check things out himself first. The Royal Guard continued walking, unaware that he was being followed. His ceremonial sword hung at his side, as it always did when he was in full dress uniform. To anyone unfamiliar with Royal Guards, the sword might indeed look like a weapon that could cause concern, but to Marcus it was just part of his official uniform, no different from the brass buttons on his jacket or the chin strap on his hat. As Marcus turned onto a less busy street, Sergeant Williams decided it was time to investigate. He turned on his flashing lights and pulled the patrol car over to the curb just ahead of the walking figure. The blue lights reflected off the windows of nearby shops, and a few early morning pedestrians stopped to see what was happening. Marcus saw the police car stop and immediately felt confused. He had done nothing wrong and couldn't understand why. A police officer would want to speak with him, but he was trained to cooperate with all law enforcement, so he continued walking toward the car, ready to answer any questions the officer might have. Sergeant Williams stepped out of his vehicle, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. The man in the red uniform was indeed carrying what appeared to be a sword, and his unusual outfit made him stand out dramatically against the ordinary London street scene. The officer had never encountered a situation quite like this before. Two men were about to meet in what would become one of the most unusual police encounters in recent London history. Neither Marcus nor Sergeant Williams had any idea that this simple interaction would soon involve dozens of people and create a story that would be talked about for years to come. As Marcus approached the police car, he could see the officer studying his uniform carefully. The morning air was crisp and the street was quiet except for the sound of distant traffic. In just a few moments, a routine walk home from work was about to become something much more complicated and interesting.